man standing. I say next time because the holidays are upon us once again, and as usual, I'm going to take the next 2 weeks off for Christmas and New Year's and all the jam-packed family fun contained therein. But we'll be back on January the 8th for the sack of Rome, the rise of Attila, and the rest of the rocket sled ride into the abyss. Before we go, though, I should also mention that a few spots have opened up on the History of Rome's next tour in March, so if someone's been asking you what you want for Saturnalia, I'm just saying, that would be a pretty awesome present. Okay, happy Saturnalia to you all, and I'll see you next year. This week's episode is brought to you by Audible. As you know, Audible is the internet's leading provider of audio entertainment with over 100,000 titles to choose from. When you're done with this episode, go to audiblepodcast.com/Rome. That again, audiblepodcast.com/Rome. By going to that address, you qualify for a free book download when you sign up for a 14-day trial membership. There is no obligation to continue the service, and you can cancel anytime and keep the free book download. You can also keep going with one of the monthly subscription options and get great deals on all future audiobook purchases. This week, I am going to go with a recommendation from listener Patrick Baker, what looks to be the absolutely fascinating A History of the World in 6 Glasses by Tom Standage, which tracks the history of civilization by way of 6 key beverages: beer, wine, spirits, coffee, tea, and cola. It looks to be a fantastic listen, so just remember to go to audiblepodcast.com/Rome so that they know who sent you. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome. Episode 164, The Sack of Rome. Okay, where were we? When we left off last time, the Western Roman Empire was in the middle of a diplomatic crisis. The Gothic king Alaric had spent the last year holding the city of Rome's head underwater, letting it up to breathe for a bit, before plunging it back underwater again, as a part of a larger strategy to force the Emperor Honorius to give in to his demands. But Honorius had apparently concluded that since it wasn't his head in the bucket, he was under no immediate pressure to make a deal with the Goths, even if, as we saw at the end of the last episode, the deal on the table was a really, really good deal for Rome. So we now find Alaric presently back in Rome, holding the city's collective head underwater once again, this time with the added twist of forcing the Senate to appoint a puppet emperor named Priscus Attalus. Alaric was probably hoping that the people of Italy would take note of how disconnected from reality Honorius had become, how much his intransigence threatened their lives and property, and how much better off they would be maybe recognizing the Goth-backed Attalus rather than continuing to support the isolated and delusional Honorius. I say the people of Italy rather than the people of the Western Empire because, as you'll also recall, control of the northern provinces had been lost back in 406, first to the semi-anarchy that had set in after the barbarian invasion of New Year's Eve, and then to the semi-imperial order of the usurper Constantine III. Not that he was actually a usurper anymore. Alaric's presence in Italy had forced Honorius to recognize Constantine as a legitimate imperial colleague. But if you thought that this recognition would prove to be a boon to the fortunes of Constantine III, well, you just don't know the 5th century. Just a few months after receiving a purple cloak in the mail from Honorius, Constantine had to deal with a rebellion of his own. This new rebellion had its genesis in a previous rebellion that had been organized in Spain by members of the Theodosian household back in 408. Constantine had dispatched his son Constans and one of his top generals, Gerontius, to put down this revolt, which, the Theodosians not being the most popular family on the block these days, they were able to do fairly quickly. Constans then returned to his father's headquarters at Arles, leaving Gerontius in control of Spain. Unfortunately, the general's ego swelled considerably at the sight of his newfound autonomy, and he decided to challenge Constantine's rule by arranging for his troops to elevate a local Spanish noble named Maximus to the rank of Augustus. As if that was not bad enough, Constantine found out about this little rebellion at the same time he found out that a group of still hostile barbarians had broken through the defensive lines keeping them penned into Gaul, and they were now crossing into Spain unchecked. Now you might think that this would be a good thing for Constantine. You know, make Gerontius deal with the barbarians, get two enemies to fight each other, and then swoop in and knock out the exhausted victor. But sadly, rather than fight, the two sides joined forces. Gerontius was apparently able to get through to these tribes where Constantine had failed, so rather than grinding each other down into dust, each reinforced the other. Now facing an almost certain attack from the direction of Spain, Constantine was further dismayed to learn that the province of Britannia, which had been the cradle of his own rebellion, was now breaking off ties with him as well. After Constantine had left with almost all the available Roman forces, the island had come under heavy attack by Saxon pirates. Since Constantine appeared disinterested in their plight, in late 409 the people of Britain ejected Constantine's few remaining officials and took the defense and governance of their island into their own hands. Just that spring, Constantine III had been recognized and legitimate ruler of the entire northwest quadrant of the Roman Empire. Now, he was surrounded by enemies, defending an ever smaller patch of grass in the middle of Gaul. Over the winter of 409-410, Constantine meditated on his ever-worsening position and resolved to make one last high-risk play to salvage the situation. When spring came, he was going to invade Italy and depose Honorius. He had been in contact with members of the Ravenna court who were thoroughly dissatisfied with the emperor, and they had encouraged Constantine to march across the Alps and topple him from power. As soon as the passes thawed, Constantine was on the move. Now, unfortunately for us, the details of this campaign are sketchy, and all we really know is that the invasion failed. Honorius had been reinforced by troops from the east, helpfully provided by the eastern prefect Anthemius, who had every reason to want Honorius to remain in power, which, combined with the large, it was probably enough to send the general scurrying back to Arles. Meanwhile, down in Rome, Alaric was having problems of his own. He had made Priscus Attalus Augustus for two basic reasons. First, to gain leverage in his negotiations with Honorius, and second, to have a puppet civil official on the throne who would do what Alaric told him to do. Attalus was failing him on both fronts. Honorius seemed more resistant than ever to negotiations, especially after successfully repelling Constantine, and far from acting as a mere puppet, Attalus was challenging and resisting Gothic commands, most especially on the question of North Africa. Alaric wanted Attalus to cross over and seize control of the all-important grain supply chain, which Attalus was fine with, but not if it meant using Gothic forces. Attalus did not like the optics of using foreigners to seize Roman territory. If he was going to do it, he was going to use regular Roman forces to do it, which would at least give the operation a veneer of legal dignity. But of course, Attalus didn't have sufficient regular forces available to pull off the operation, so his refusal to use the Goths meant that he was refusing to go seize North Africa. Annoyed that his creation was frustrating rather than facilitating his plans, Alaric unceremoniously deposed Attalus in early 410. But don't worry, kids, we haven't heard the last of Priscus Attalus. So now Alaric was back to square one. And to make matters worse, there had been a power shift up in the Ravenna court that did not bode well for the Gothic king. Olympius, the man who had engineered Stilicho's execution, had fallen from favor, and he had been replaced by Sarus, the Gothic general who had defected to Rome's banner following the Battle of Verona in 402. This was a rotten development for Alaric, because where Olympius had stymied negotiations because of a general anti-barbarian bias, Sarus is about to stymie negotiations because of a specific hatred of Alaric. Their two families had been rivals within the Gothic community for I don't even know how long, and after the defeat at Verona, Sarus had taken the opportunity to throw his lot in with Rome, rather than continue to take orders from the hated and now beaten Alaric. So if Alaric thought he had trouble extracting concessions from Honorius before, well, now that his blood enemy Sarus had the Emperor's ear, there was no chance of anything ever getting done. Alaric pressed on, however, and in midsummer he was back in North Italy to resume negotiations with Ravenna. When these talks appeared to be progressing, Sarus used his authority as commander of the Emperor's troops to destroy any and all goodwill between the two sides. Without warning, he ordered his troops to attack a contingent of Alaric's army. Nothing came of the battle, and it did not drive the two sides into open war, but it did convince Alaric that talking was officially hopeless. He was never going to get anywhere he wanted to go by remaining at the bargaining table. It was time to act. So he withdrew back to Rome and placed it under siege for the third time in just over a year. But this time, it was not a negotiating tactic. He was not waiting for the Senate to buy him off. No, this time he was going all in. The Goths were going to sack Rome. As the siege began, the first major prize of the assault fell into Alaric's lap. Gallia Placidia, the youngest daughter of Theodosius and one-time fiancé of Stilicho's now-dead son Eucharius, had been living in Rome following Olympius's coup, and when this much more serious siege began, she attempted to flee the city. Captured by Gothic soldiers, she became a highly valuable hostage to the Gothic cause. As we will see, Placidia's stay with the Goths would not be temporary, and it would be a full decade before she was released back into the custody of the Ravenna court. But fear not, she was no passive hostage. Her capture in 410 was simply the beginning of a remarkable political career that will see her first influencing and then outright directing Roman state policy until her death in 450. We will have much more to say about good Gallia Placidia as we move forward. So, welcome to the stage, Your Highness. Which brings us to, yes, here we are. Way back in episode 10, Barbarians at the Gates, we discussed the sacking of Rome by Brennus and his long-haired Gauls. When it was all over, I noted that it would be some 800 years before Rome was sacked again. Well, here we are, 800 years and 170-odd episodes later, on the extreme opposite end of the bell curve of Rome's power. On August the 24th, 410 AD, slaves inside Rome opened the Salarian Gate, allowing Alaric and his Goths to come flooding into the city. The Roman city militia, just enough to man the impressive Aurelian walls, had no hope of standing against the Goths in open combat. For the first time in almost a millennium, Rome was helpless and at the mercy of an enemy. But interestingly,